Chief Inspector Reginald Wexford lives and works in the fictional mid-Sussex town of Kingsmarkham in south-eastern England. When some of the stories were televised, the town of Rumsey in Hampshire was chosen for filming because it was very much like the Kingsmarkham of the Ruth Random stories. Kingsmarkham is how many people imagine an English market town. Pretty and picturesque, with a beautiful church and plenty of wonderful countryside nearby. Wexford is also very much like an English country town policeman. He is more interested in people and the reasons for their crimes than in forensic evidence or clues. Islands of Death is set in the mid of 1960s. It was a time before mobile phones, when television pictures were in black and white, and the Beatles were the world's most famous pop star. In the UK, murderers were often killed for their crimes. However, capital punishment had been suspended in 1965 and was finally stopped completely in 1969. Murderers now face life in prison instead of death. In a news of death, Wexford is forced to look again at the first murder case of his career, the murder of an old woman called Rose Primero in 1950. Her murderer had been caught and hanged, but now someone started asking questions about the person who was convicted. Was he really the killer, or it could be someone else? The person asking the questions has important reasons of his own for wanting to know to prove that the convicted killer was innocent.
It all started with a letter sent by me to Chief Inspector Wexford.
Dear sir, you will remember the case of Herbert Archer Painter. I understand that you were in charge of it, so I decided to come to you before making my inquiries.
I went to talk with Wexford and I questioned why he was so sure the painter was guilty. Basically, our whole conversation was about the case and about some assumptions regarding those involved in the murder, like Painter's wife and his daughter. I went to Mr. Kershaw's house and met him and his wife. They said there were worries regarding the marriage of Tess and Charles, such as money, job, and where they would live. Although I tried talking about Tess's father, Herbert the painter, Mrs. Kershaw refused to. I spoke with Mr. Kershaw and he said he was somehow sure he was not the murderer. Then I went back to King's Markham. I went to talk with Wexford and I said I wanted to see some people involved in the murder of Mrs. Primero. Though we were interrupted by Sergeant Martin, he was saying that a man involved in an accident wanted to talk with me. I went to the place where the man was hit. I couldn't talk with him because there was too much blood coming from his mouth, and unfortunately, he died. I discovered that Mrs. Primero was nice to Elizabeth, and that after the murder happened, her mother always took the girls to psychiatrists. I went to the courtroom with Mrs. Josephine Krilling, while Elizabeth Krilling, her daughter, was being judged for driving drunk. I offered a bail to her and she accepted it. After the end of the trial, I met Burden and Wakeford. We received a letter saying that Mrs. Josephine wanted to talk with me in the afternoon. The same day, my wife called me and said that Tess could not marry Charles. When I went to talk with Mrs. Josephine Krilling, she didn't recognize me. I wanted that conversation to be quick because I was really scared. Later that day, I had a chat with Burden, and we talked about the possibility of Mrs. Josephine Krilling being the murderer. I visited Alice Flower, and we talked about Roger and his sisters. She said to me that the day of Mrs. Primero's death was terrible and that she offered to go and speak to Painter, but Mrs. Primero did not let her. talked about a smoke and that with that kind of noise, a man could have gone upstairs, searched the bedroom, and come down again. Alice told me she never liked Mrs. Krilling because she was only interested in Primero's money, that instead would go to Roger, who was a lovely person, of course, according to her. After 8 o'clock, I went back to the hotel, danced with a woman called Imogen, and went to my bedroom. I was awakened by the sound of the telephone. It was my wife saying that she had letters from Charles and that he was coming to King's Markham the next day. I called Irene Kershaw, and she explained that my son had an argument with Tess and that she was coming home the next day. I asked her for her husband's business number, and she gave me. I wrote a letter to Painter's Army office. After leaving the post office, I met with Imogen Knight, and she convinced me to go to the church at Forby. While walking between gravestones, one name caught my eye. It was John Grace's gravestone. At the same time, I remembered Wexford saying something about a young man who had died in an accident before a vicar could see him. The next day, Charles and I were sitting in the hotel lounge, while he was telling me he was going to see Roger Primero at 11:30 that morning. Charles phoned Roger before he got to King's Markham, and he was sure there was something suspicious about Roger. I looked at his watch, and I saw it was 10 o'clock already, so we walked up the High Street and over the Kingsbrook Bridge. I asked him if he could tell where this came from.
Go shepherd to your rest, your tale is told. The Lamb of God takes shepherd to his fold.
Told him I saw it on a gravestone in Forby churchyard. Charles questioned if I wanted to help him and Tess or not, and I began to feel angry. We resumed walking. Then I suddenly saw Josephine Krilling, stopped, and put my hand on his arm. He asked what the matter was, and I explained that I really didn't want to talk to Josephine, but before we could walk out, she saw us and was hurrying towards us. He asked what the matter was, and I explained that I really didn't want to talk to Josephine, but before we could walk out, she saw us and hurried towards us. She forced us to come to the Caruso Cafe and have a cup of coffee with her. She talked about my son in a low voice. Suddenly, she banged the table and screamed, "Service!" We continued talking, and she said she wasn't interested in money, but I think she was. I met Wexford, and we talked about who'd take the $10,000. By law, it should have been divided equally between the three. Suddenly, a shadow fell across Charles's face.
Tess hadn't spoken to me for 2 days. I can't lose her. I can't.
Then, without looking at me, he turned and went to the hotel. I talked with Ide, which in fact was Imogen Primero, since she married Roger. Later that day, Charles went to see Roger Primero's sisters. He told Angela he worked for the Sunday Planet and should be called Mr. Bauman. He said that when he got there, he noticed that the two weren't rich and had a lot of economic difficulties. The sisters revealed that the money should have been shared and that their mother said that Roger would help them, but he didn't, and they were too young to understand what was happening at the time. In fact, by law, Roger was right to get all the money, since the sisters were adopted. Well, they couldn't in September of 1950, but then they could on 1st October 1950. Strange, huh? Mr. Kershaw, Tess, Charles, and I set up to visit Prophet House that weekend. Everybody wanted to go, but I didn't. So I said I'd see them later and then walked across the street to Dora's shop. Suddenly, I saw some postcards with that poem. That poem. The woman saw me looking at it, and she said,
That's by our local poet. He was just a young man when he was killed in a road accident.
she explained to me that,
Visitors to the village think that it was a shepherd.
but that she had
I
to.
explained to them that the word shepherd used to mean poet.
I asked her if any of his work was ever published, and she answered that most of the boy's poems had disappeared. Several minutes after 12 o'clock, people began to come out of the church. Then I realized that it was Alice Flower's funeral. I saw Primero and his wife, and suddenly Charles came towards me. I thought the Primeros would be gone with them, but I was wrong. When we were walking, Roger Primero turned and saw Charles, whose face went white. Charles and Roger fought while Imogen and I were in a terribly awkward position. Charles said that he and I were at King's Markham to gather information,
I don't understand.
said Imogen. I tried to stop Charles, but then Mrs. Primero said.
It isn't true.
She said it wasn't true that Primero had cheated his sister's share of his grandmother's money and that he hid himself in Victor's Peace on an evening in December 16 years before. And then, in a small voice, she asked, Is it? There was a moment of silence, and then Primero shouted.
It was all legal.
Imogen put her hand on her husband's arm and went home. After the occurrence, we met Wexford, and he said he didn't know that the Primero sisters were adopted. He also revealed that Mr. Primero told him about Charles' visit to his home. He emphasized that he could make contact with people concerned in the Primero case and not to make trouble. Charles told him all the story, and Wexford listened patiently.
Of course, you say that Roger had an alibi.
Said Charles, but Wexford answered his alibi wasn't checked. The Kershaws left the room, since Wexford wouldn't answer any of our questions with Tess listening. Then Charles asked Wexford why wasn't Primero's alibi checked. He spoke slowly and clearly that,
Mrs. Primero was killed between 6:25 and 7 o'clock, September 24th, 1950.
and that he saw Roger at 6:30 in Sunbury, 5 miles away. We continued discussing. I thanked the chief inspector, and then we left. Tess and Charles began to argue as soon as we were all inside Kershaw's car. They stopped arguing, and we left the car, leaving Kershaw to drive back to the hotel. Went to the chemist shop since Tess had a headache. I was waiting anxiously by the door when I saw Elizabeth Krillin inside. Tess had her face white when she left the establishment, but I don't know why. Charles wanted to apologize to Imogen, but I said I would do that, since I like them and I would like to make sure there was no problem between us. I went to my room. There was a letter waiting for me. It was from Painter's army officer. He said he was not asked to speak about Herbert Arthur Painter at his trial. He talked about Painter's illness and about the time he was in the army. I phoned Imogen Primero and apologized to her about what happened. I thought Victor's Peace would be a good place to meet. She said she got a key and that it would be great if we met at 8 o'clock. We went down, and Tess and her father were standing in the hall waiting,
I wish that I hadn't seen Elizabeth crying,
said Tess.
but I also wish that I talked to her.
I told her their lives were different now, and Kershaw remembered they should go home. It was raining heavily, and I went to Victor's Peace. I called him again, but there was no answer. and her car had not been outside, but I was sure that I was not alone in the house. I saw a raincoat hanging. I opened the living room door and looked in. All of a sudden, Imogen appeared and apologized for being late. She explained she knew nothing about the money and the Primero sisters, but that Roger had agreed to let them have their share of the money. She looked unhappy, and I felt sorry for her. Imogen went out, closing the door behind her, leaving me alone. After some time, I went out into the hall, and I saw the raincoat was no longer there. I began digging the house and found some pieces of broken glass. I began to pick up the pieces and put them by the wall when I heard the sound of feet. I moved to stand up and accidentally put my hand down on a piece of broken glass, then shouted, "Oh, I've cut myself!" Then a girl's voice cried.
Uncle Herbert! Oh, God!
There was blood in my arms, but I managed to catch Elizabeth Grilling when she fainted. What was she doing there? She explained she had an argument with her mother, and that she made herself a bed upstairs, and that she came there sometimes. She explained that she didn't know that it was blood. She thought it was paint. So she went on remembering all the past.
She has the only real friend that I had.
Elizabeth said.
I never saw her again.
I said to her she saw Tess that afternoon, and that she told me she'd have never told Tess who she was.
I going upstairs now. Give Des my love.
By the time that I found the doctor's house, my hand was hurting badly. I thanked the doctor, then went back to the hotel. When I got to the hotel, Charles was writing a letter to Tess. He asked me where I was that night, and I replied I was just taking a look at Victor's piece. I also said Elizabeth Grilling was there because she had had an argument with her mother,
Did you leave her there? A crazy kid?
said Charles.
We should go and get her.
I nodded, then gave him the car keys. It was around 11 o'clock when we arrived at Mrs. Grilling's house. Charles rang the front door bell again and again, but no one answered. We walked through weeds and long grass to get to the French windows. Charles entered the room, and I followed him. I went behind a chair when my foot touched something. Clothes and more clothes. I reached down with my hands. I could not speak. My hands were wet. Charles turned the light switch, and there she was. Mrs. Grilling lay on the floor between the chair and the wall. She had a stocking around her neck, and she was wearing something long and pink. She had been strangled,
She's covered in blood.
shouted Charles. Wexford said it was not blood. Instead, it was cherry brand. I was too tired to listen to Charles, so I sat in a chair. The next morning was grey and cool. I have been to Forby. I've seen a photograph, I've got a letter, and I've talked to a doctor. Wexford said I was right. We were both right. Tess's father wasn't the murderer, but Painter was. I went to see Mrs. Kershaw. She told me all her story, and I cried a lot. Mr. Kershaw thanked me for doing something he had never done. Talked to his wife. That's it, Ruth. You can fill in the gaps. I hope we see each other again in the future.